The scent of beeswax and regret clung to the air in Lady Honoria's drawing room. Clara, standing by the heavy velvet curtains, did not need to turn to know that her great-aunt was watching her. It was a familiar pressure on the back of her neck, as tangible as a cold draft. She was adjusting the fall of the drapery, a task that was not hers, but had become hers, like so many others. The footman, new and nervous, had left them slightly askew, and Lady Honoria did not abide by things being askew. Clara, the voice was thin and sharp, a pinprick in the room, oppressive quiet. Do stop fussing with the curtains like a housemaid. You will get dust on your cuffs. Clara smoothed the final fold of fabric and turned her hands clasped loosely before her. Her cuffs were pristine. She had ensured they were, just as she had ensured the tea was brewed to the precise moment of perfection and the silver polished until it hurt the eyes. Of course, Anta, her great-aunt, Lady Honoria Gadsby, was a monument to dissatisfaction, propped against a mountain of silk pillows on her chaise longue. Her face, a delicate web of wrinkles, was set in its usual expression of faint disapproval, as if the world were a dish served slightly too cold. She had taken Clara in 5 years ago, after her father's disastrous financial ruin and subsequent death, an act of charity that was mentioned at least once a day. It was a debt Clara was expected to repay, in the currency of quiet servitude. Mr. Finch is late," Lady Honoria announced, tapping a single bearing finger on the arm of her chaise. "It is inconsiderate. He knows my nerves cannot tolerate tardiness." Clara glanced at the mantel clock. "He is precisely on time, aunt. It is just now striking 3 at." Lady Honoria waved a dismissive hand. "To be on time is to be late for a person of my standing. It shows a lack of appropriate eagerness." She peered at Clara, her eyes narrowing. "There is a smudge on your chin." Clara's hand flew to her face, her fingers finding nothing. It was an old, cruel game, one of 100 small ways her aunt reminded her of her place. She was the poor relation, the companion, the unpaid manager of a household that would otherwise crumble under her aunt's capricious neglect. She had learned not to show the sting. She simply lowered her hand. My apologies. I will attend to it, as see that you do. We have a guest." Clara did not move toward the mirror. She knew there was nothing there. Instead, she retrieved her aunt's discarded shawl from the floor, folded it with practiced neatness, and laid it over the back of a nearby chair. It was in these small acts of order, of quiet defiance against the chaos of her aunt's temperament, that she found her equilibrium. She was composed. She was watchful. These were the walls she had built around herself, and they were strong. The butler announced him then. "Mr. Abernathy, my lady." A man stepped into the room, bowing slightly. He was not the florid, gossiping Mr. Finch, whom Lady Honoria expected for her weekly dose of society chatter. This man was tall and spare, dressed in sober gray, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from worry. He held a leather portfolio, and his eyes, missing nothing, took in the room, Lady Honoria on her chaise. And finally, Clara standing quietly by the window. "I am not Mr. Finch," he said, his voice as dry as old paper. My apologies for the intrusion. I am Elias Abernathy, solicitor. I had an appointment with Lady Honoria." Lady Honoria sat up a little straighter, her displeasure warring with her curiosity. A solicitor. That was far more interesting than Mr. Finch. Have no such appointment. The letter was sent 2 days ago, Mr. Abernathy stated, not as an apology, but as a fact. Perhaps it was misplaced. He glanced for a fraction of a second at the untidy pile of correspondence on a side table. Clara knew exactly where the letter was. She had placed it on her aunt's secretary herself that morning, but her aunt rarely attended to anything that did not promise immediate amusement. I believe I saw it, Aunt Honoria. Shall I fetch it?" Before her aunt could answer, Mr. Abernathy spoke again, his gaze fixed on Clara. That will not be necessary. My business is unconventional. It may be better discussed in private. He looked pointedly from Lady Honoria to Clara and back again. Clara is my companion. She stays, Lady Honoria snapped, enjoying the small drama. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of her. She is as silent and useful as that fire screen. Clara felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, but her expression remained placid. To be compared to an inanimate object was not a new experience. Mr. Abernathy gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting the terms of this strange battlefield. As you wish, my lady. I am here on behalf of my client, Viscount Blackwood. The name fell into the room and silenced it. Lord Maxwell Blackwood of Blackmore, a man of immense standing and even more immense tragedy. A widower for 2 years, his grief was the stuff of local legend, a dark brooding force that had left his estate and his 3 young children to founder. He was a man isolated by his reputation, feared for his temper, and flattered by everyone. No one, it was said, ever told Lord Blackwood the truth. A Blackwood. A Lady Honoria was intrigued. What business could he possibly have with me? Mr. Abernathy's gaze flickered to Clara again, and this time it lingered. My business, Lady Honoria, is not with you. It is with your great niece, Miss Clara Ashton. The silence that followed was of a different quality altogether. It was sharp and brittle. Clara felt her aunt's eyes on her, no longer dismissive, but filled with a sudden, sharp suspicion. Clara herself felt a strange lurch in her chest, a feeling so alien she could not immediately name it. It was confusion, mixed with a dizzying, terrifying drop of something like hope. With Clara, Lady Honoria's laugh was a dry rustle. What nonsense. She is a penniless orphan. What could a man like Lord Blackwood want with her? Mr. Abernathy did not smile. He opened his portfolio. Lord Blackwood, my lady, is in need of something quite specific. He requires a person of unimpeachable integrity, formidable intelligence, and a deep practical understanding of household management and accountancy. He has, for 2 years, been ill-served by those he has employed. He paused, letting the euphemism hang in the air. I have made extensive inquiries. The name of Miss Ashton's late father was mentioned as a man of great financial acumen. It was suggested that his daughter had inherited his gift. Clara's mind reeled her father. Before the ruin, he had been a brilliant merchant, and he had taught her everything. He had believed a woman's mind was as capable of mastering ledgers as a man's. He had let her help him, poring over columns of figures in his study, a secret world of numbers and logic that she had loved. After his death, that knowledge had become her private shame, a useless relic of a better life. She had used it only to secretly untangle her aunt's chaotic finances. A silent, thankless task. My client's estate, Blackmore, is in a state of disarray. Mr. Abernathy continued, his voice even. His tenants are suffering. His household is without a firm hand. His children, he hesitated. His children need stability. Lord Blackwood has authorized me to make an offer of employment, a most generous one, for the position of household steward. The word was absurd. A woman could be a housekeeper, a governess, a companion. A steward was a man of business, of authority. Lady Honoria found her voice. You are mad. You would offer a woman that position? A girl with no name and no fortune. It is an insult to the Viscountess station. She is a companion. She arranges flowers and reads poetry aloud. I have reason to believe she does a great deal more than that, Mr. Abernathy said, his eyes on Clara's still hands. I am told this household runs with a Swiss watch precision that has nothing to do with its mistress. I am told that the tradesmen are paid on time, a feat in itself. I notice effort. My client needs effort. For the first time, Clara spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the charged atmosphere. Why are you here, Mr. Abernathy? Why not send a letter? He met her gaze directly. Because Miss Ashton, I did not believe a letter would be permitted to reach you. And because the situation at Blackmore is urgent. The trustees meet in 3 months to review the estate's management. If significant improvements are not made, they may move to have Lord Blackwood's authority over his children's inheritance curtailed. He needs an ally he can trust. Now, a deadline, a threat. It was not a simple job offer, it was a desperate rescue mission. She will not be going anywhere, Lady Honoria declared, her face flushed with anger. The anger of a woman whose most useful possession was about to be taken from her. She is my blood. She has a duty to me. Clara looked at her aunt, at the familiar lines of selfish possession on her face. She looked at the polished furniture and the perfectly arranged curtains and the silent, suffocating air of the room. She had been useful here. Necessary, even. But she had never been wanted. She was a tool, and a tool was being coveted by another. I should like to consider the offer, Clara said, her voice shaking almost imperceptibly. Consider, her aunt shrieked. There is nothing to consider. I forbid it. You have no authority to forbid it, Mr. Abernathy stated flatly. Miss Ashton is of age. She is free to accept or decline as she sees fit. He turned back to Clara. Lord Blackwood is prepared to offer a salary that would ensure your independence for the rest of your life, whether you remain in his employ for a year or for 10. He asks only one thing in return, that you bring order to his house. He paused. He is not an easy man, Miss Ashton. He will argue with you. He will test you. He is a man walled up in his own grief. But he is a good man. And he is desperate. Clara thought of the smudge that wasn't there, of being compared to a fire screen. She thought of 5 years of biting her tongue, of shrinking herself to fit into the small, airless space her aunt allowed her. She looked at the solicitor, a man who saw not a poor relation, but a person of skill. When would I be expected to start? She asked. The question was the first stone thrown in a war she did not yet understand. It was the beginning of every argument she was destined to win, and it was the first moment that Lord Maxwell Blackwood, miles away in his cold, silent house, began, without knowing it, to listen. The journey to Blackmore was a passage from one world to another. Clara left her aunt's house, with a single trunk and a small, hard knot of fear in her stomach. Lady Honoria had not spoken to her since her declaration, her silence, a weapon of furious disapproval. Clara had packed her few belongings with a sense of unreality, half expecting her aunt to burst in and physically bar her exit. But she had not. She had simply let her go, as one might discard a tool that had suddenly revealed a will of its own. Blackmore was a grand estate, but as the carriage turned into the long winding drive, a feeling of neglect became palpable. The verges were overgrown, and a line of ancient oaks had been allowed to shed their branches across the lane, creating a gauntlet of skeletal limbs. The house itself appeared in the distance, a vast pile of gray stone against a gray sky. It was magnificent in its architecture, but desolate in its spirit. Dozens of windows stared out like blank eyes, and no smoke curled from the great chimneys, despite the autumn chill. It was a house holding its breath. The carriage drew to a halt before a massive front door, its brass handle green with tarnish. Before the driver could dismount, the door was pulled open and the Viscount himself stood there. He was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered and dressed in severe black, the funereal garb he had famously refused to abandon since his wife's death. His hair was dark, his face starkly handsome, but etched with a tension that seemed to pull at his skin. It was a face accustomed to command, but his eye, startling, intense, gray held a deep, unassuaged weariness. He was the lonely king of a decaying kingdom. He did not offer a greeting. His gaze swept over her, taking in her simple traveling dress and her composed expression. It was a swift, assessing look, and Clara felt it like a physical touch. She met his gaze without flinching. "You are Miss Ashton," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth. I am, my lord, Abernathy, vouched for you. He is rarely wrong, but he has never before recommended a woman to run my estate. His tone was laced with skepticism, a challenge, issued before she had even crossed the threshold. Perhaps, my lord, he has never before found a woman suited to the task, Clara replied, her own voice steady. A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance across his face. He had expected meekness. He had expected gratitude. He had not expected a direct return of his serve. Come inside," he said abruptly, turning his back on her and striding into the cavernous hall. Clara followed, instructing the driver to wait with her trunk. The hall was breathtaking and heartbreaking in equal measure. A soaring ceiling was lost in shadow, and priceless tapestries depicting ancient hunts were coated in a fine layer of dust. The air was cold, colder than it had been outside, and smelled of damp stone and something else stagnation. It was the smell of a house where life had stopped. Lord Blackwood led her not to a drawing room or a parlor, but to a library. It was the only room they passed that showed signs of recent life. Books were piled on tables, some lying open on the floor. A half-empty glass of brandy sat on the mantelpiece, and the fire in the grate was little more than a pile of sullen gray ash. This was his fortress. He gestured to a chair, but did not take one himself. He stood before the dead fire, his hands clasped behind his back, a formidable, intimidating figure. Let us be clear, Miss Ashton," he began, his voice hard. "I have agreed to this experiment against my better judgment. My household is in chaos. My accounts are a disaster. My children are my children." He stopped, the word catching in his throat. Your task is to impose order. You will begin with the ledgers. I want a full report on my desk, within a week. You will have access to the records, nothing more. The staff will continue to report to me." Clara listened, her hands folded in her lap. He was setting the terms of his surrender, trying to retain control even as he admitted he had lost it. This was their first argument, and he did not yet know it had begun. When he finished, a heavy silence fell. He expected her to agree, to murmur her assent and scurry off to the account books. She did not. She looked at him, her gaze direct. My lord, if those are your terms, then I am afraid I must ask my driver to turn the carriage around. I cannot possibly succeed." His jaw tightened. "You are refusing before you have even begun." "I'm stating a fact," Clara said, her voice calm and reasonable, as if explaining a simple sum. "You have described a house in a state of systemic failure. The ledgers are not the disease, they are a symptom. The disease is a lack of clear authority, of coherent management. If the staff continue to report to you a master who admits he is overwhelmed and distracted, they will continue to receive conflicting or non-existent direction. They will resent my presence and undermine my efforts, and you will have wasted your money and my time." He stared at her, his gray eyes turning to slate. No one spoke to him this way. The force of his displeasure was a palpable thing in the room. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she held his gaze. She had learned from her aunt that to show fear was to invite attack. "And what," he said, his voice dangerously low, "are your terms?" Then, this was the moment, the precipice. Before I answer, you will tell me the truth." "All of it?" She said quietly. "I do not bargain with half a story." Mr. Abernathy spoke of trustees. "What is the precise nature of the threat?" He looked as though she had struck him. He paced away from the fireplace, a caged animal. He clearly was not used to being questioned, let alone challenged. For a long moment she thought he would throw her out. Instead he came to a halt, his back to her. My late wife's father established a trust for the children," he said, his voice strained. Its trustees are my father-in-law, the Earl of Penshurst, and 2 of his cronies. They have never approved of me. They believe I am intemperate, unstable. They are using the estate's mismanagement as leverage. If I cannot demonstrate control and solvency by the quarterly meeting in January, they will petition the courts for guardianship of my children. He turned to face her, and for a second, the mask of the cold, arrogant Viscount fell away. In its place was a man terrified of losing the only thing he had left. They want to take my children from me, Miss Ashton. The confession hung between them, raw and painful. Now she understood the depth of his desperation. Now she could set her terms. Very well. She said, her voice softening slightly. Here is what I require. First, full and uncontested authority over the entire household. That includes the hiring and dismissal of staff, the management of all domestic budgets, and the ordering of all supplies. The staff will report to me, and only to me. He started to object, but she held up a hand. Second, she continued, pressing her advantage, will have access to all estate records, not just the household ledgers. The farm accounts, the tenant agreements, the contracts with suppliers. I cannot fix the house if the estate that supports it is bleeding money. This is preposterous, he began. You are asking for the authority of a land agent. I am asking for the tools to do the job you are hiring me for. She corrected him gently. Third, I will not enter your house as a mere functionary to be ignored until needed. I expect to be consulted on matters that affect the household. I will take my evening meal with you and your children, unless you prefer I take it alone in my rooms. I will not eat with the servants. I am not a servant, I am your steward. She paused, letting the audacious demand settle. She was drawing a line, not just for her own dignity, but for the success of her mission. If she was seen by the household as a person of consequence, her authority would hold. If she was seen as a glorified clerk, she would fail. He was silent for a long, long time. Studying her, he was a man who listened to no one, who argued as a matter of principle. And this woman, this stranger, had walked into his house and laid down the law. She had won her first argument by refusing to have it on his terms. He noticed the lack of tremor in her hands. He noticed the directness of her gaze, which was neither insolent nor fearful, but simply clear. He noticed that she had not once tried to flatter him or appeal to his vanity. She had appealed only to logic. He had spent 2 years surrounded by whispers, by cloying sympathy, by the fearful obedience of his staff, and the grasping machinations of his in-laws. He had not had an honest conversation with anyone since his wife, Eleanor, had died. And now, this quiet woman in a plain gray dress was being more honest with him than anyone had dared to be. She was not offering sympathy. She was offering competence, a lifeline. He walked over to the bell pull and gave it a firm tug. You have your terms, Miss Ashton. A moment later, a harried-looking housekeeper appeared at the door. Mrs. Gable, Lord Blackwood said, his voice ringing with an authority that had been absent moments before. This is Miss Ashton. She is the new household steward. From this moment on, you and all other staff will report directly to her. Her authority in this house is to be considered my own. Is that understood? The housekeeper's jaw dropped. She stared at Clara, then back at the Viscount, utterly bewildered. My lorda a steward. Is understood? He repeated, his voice like iron. Yes, my lord. The woman stammered. He said. Now, have Miss Ashton's trunk taken to the Rose Suite, and have fires lit in every room. He turned to Clara. The argument was over. He had not precisely lost. He had conceded. He had, for the first time in a very long time, listened, and as Clara followed the stunned Mrs. Gable out of the library, she felt the weight of her victory. It was heavy and cold, and it was only the beginning. The Rose Suite was beautiful, its furnishings elegant, but shrouded in dust cloths, its air still and frigid. It was a room that had been waiting for a guest who never came. As two young maids scurried to pull off the covers and light a fire, Clara stood at the window, looking out over a neglected garden. The cold house was now her domain, and its resistance was a palpable force. Her first week at Blackmore was a silent battle fought on multiple fronts. The first was with the house itself. It was a place steeped in grief. Every room seemed to hold a memory of the late Viscountess, Eleanor. Her portrait, painted in happier times, dominated the grand staircase. A beautiful, laughing woman whose presence made the current gloom feel even more profound. Clara gave quiet orders. Curtains were to be opened every morning to let in the light. Fires were to be kept burning. The dust cloths were to be removed permanently. She was not trying to erase the memory of the woman who had lived here. She was simply trying to let the house breathe again. This was a distinction no one else seemed to grasp. The staff, led by the resentful Mrs. Bars, Gable, were her second front. They obeyed her direct orders, cowed by the Viscountess' declaration, but they did so with a sullen reluctance. They saw her as a usurper, an outsider of questionable status. Whispers followed her down the cold corridors. Clara ignored them. She did not try to win them over with charm or camaraderie. She won them over, slowly and painstakingly, with competence. She began in the kitchens. The cook, a tyrannical man named Monsieur Dubois, complained that his suppliers were unreliable. Clara spent a morning with the kitchen ledgers and discovered the truth. The suppliers were reliable, but the bills had been paid so erratically that Blackmore was no longer a priority customer. She summoned the butcher, the baker, and the greengrocer. She reviewed their accounts, acknowledged the estate's failings, and guaranteed them prompt payment from that day forward, in writing. Within 3 days, the quality of the food arriving at the back door improved dramatically. Monsieur Dubois did not thank her, but his complaints ceased. Mrs. Gable protested a large expenditure on new linens for the staff quarters. The old ones are perfectly serviceable, miss," she said, her arms crossed. Clara had already inspected the linens in question. Serviceable, perhaps, if you believe your staff should sleep under fabric as thin as cheesecloth. They are threadbare and patched. A content staff is an efficient staff, Mrs. Gable. See to the order. Mrs. Gable saw to the order. Lord Blackwood remained a distant, watchful presence. He kept to his library, as promised, leaving the running of the house to her. But Clara was aware of his eyes on her. He would appear silently in a doorway as she instructed a footman, or pass her in a hall as she consulted with Mrs. Gable, his expression unreadable. Their evening meals were excruciating affairs. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table, long enough for 20, the cavernous space between them filled with silence. The children were not present. They take their meals in the nursery. He had stated on the first night as if it were an immutable law of nature. That seems a lonely arrangement, Clara had observed mildly. It is how it has been done, he'd replied, his tone closing the subject. This was another argument, and Clara knew it was not yet time to engage. She ate her meals, spoke when spoken to, and endured the weight of his silence. He was testing her, waiting for her to break, to complain, to fail. She would do none of those things. She would simply do her work. Her third, and most difficult, front was the children. There were 3 of them, each a small island of grief. Arthur, at 12, was the oldest, a boy trying to carry the weight of Amana's sorrow. He was angry, sullen, and fiercely protective of his mother's memory. He looked at Clara with open hostility, as if her very presence were a betrayal. 8-year-old Edith was his opposite. She was a ghost in her own home, a silent, watchful child who rarely spoke and spent her days in the nursery, clutching a small embroidered ribbon that had belonged to her mother. She would flinch if anyone spoke too loudly, and her eyes were old with a sorrow she could not articulate. The youngest, 6-year-old Thomas, was pure, uncontained energy. He ran wild through the house and grounds, a whirlwind of noise and dirt, constantly testing the boundaries of the long-suffering nursery maid. His chaos was a different expression of the same pain that made his brother angry and his sister silent. Their governess had left a month prior, the last in a long line of them, and had not been replaced. Clara did not force herself upon them. She knew she could not win them with authority or overtures of friendship. Where every predecessor had apparently fled or failed, she would win by staying, by being a constant, predictable presence in their turbulent world. She started with small, unobtrusive acts. She noticed that the nursery was the darkest room in the house, its heavy curtains always drawn. One morning, she entered while the children were at their sparse lessons with a junior maid. "A good morning," she said quietly. She walked to the window and drew back the heavy drapes. A shaft of pale autumn sunlight streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Your mother loved the view of the rose garden from this window, did she not?" "It is a shame to keep it hidden." Arthur glared at her. How would you know what my mother loved?" asked one of the gardeners. Clara replied simply. He said, she helped him plant those very roses. She did not wait for a response, but turned and left, leaving the curtains open. The next day, she found the curtains drawn shut again. Without a word she opened them. This became a silent, daily ritual, a small argument fought with a sash cord. For a week, Arthur closed them. Then, one morning, she entered the nursery to find them already open. Arthur sat at the table, pretending to read, but his face was turned toward the light. She found Edith in a hallway, staring at her mother's portrait, her small hand twisting the worn ribbon. Clara did not speak to her. She simply stopped beside her and looked up at the painting. She was very beautiful, Clara said softly to the portrait, more than to the child. After a moment she walked on. She did this several times over the next few days. One afternoon, as she stood there, Edith spoke, her voice a tiny whisper. Her name was Eleanor. I know, Clara said gently. A lovely name. She stayed a moment longer, then left the child with her memories. With Thomas she took a different approach. She saw the nursery maid chasing him through the garden, her face a mask of exhaustion. Later that day, a large wooden chest appeared in the nursery. It was filled with old tin soldiers, a battered drum, and a collection of carved animals that had belonged to Lord Blackwood as a boy. These were your father's," Clara told the children. He said I should see if you had any use for them." Thomas stared at the toys, his eyes wide. He reached out a tentative hand and picked up a soldier, its red coat chipped and faded. For the first time that day, he was still. Lord Blackwood observed all of this from a distance. He saw the open curtains in the nursery. He heard from a footman that Miss Ashton had stood with Edith before the portrait. He saw the chest of his own childhood toys, which he had not laid eyes on in 30 years, appear in the nursery. He started an argument one evening at dinner. Have seen the household accounts," he said abruptly. The expenditure on candles has tripled." Yes, my lord," Clara said, not looking up from her plate. The house is no longer dark. It is an unnecessary expense. A house full of shadows is an unnecessary misery." She countered calmly, "especially for children. Furthermore, a well-lit corridor prevents accidents. A broken leg would be far more expensive than a few dozen candles." He fell silent. Her logic was, as always, infuriatingly sound. He had intended to reprimand her, to reassert his authority, but he had been met not with defiance, but with irrefutable reason. He was beginning to understand that arguing with Miss Ashton was like arguing with a mathematical proof. A few nights later he found her in the library, long after the rest of the house was asleep. She was bent over a large estate ledger, a single candle illuminating her focused expression, her brow furrowed in concentration. She did not seem to have noticed his entrance. He noticed the slight fraying on the cuff of her dress. He noticed the ink smudge on her forefinger. He noticed that in a house full of coldness and grief, she was a small, steady flame of diligence. You work late, Miss Ashton," he said, his voice startling her. She looked up, her composure momentarily shaken. My lord." "I did not hear you." What have you found?" he asked, nodding toward the ledger. A discrepancy," she said. In the accounts for the grain mill, the yields reported do not match the revenues recorded. For the past 18 months, she turned the book toward him, her finger tracing a column of figures. Either the mill is producing far less than it ought, or someone is pocketing the difference. He looked at the numbers, then at her. He had stared at these same ledgers for months, seeing only a meaningless jumble. She had been here 2 weeks and had already found the rot. A will speak to the mill operator tomorrow, he said. A have already sent for him, Clara replied. He will be here at 9. I thought it best we speak to him together. She had not asked for his permission. She had assumed his partnership. It was another audacious move, another argument she had won by simply acting on its conclusion. He should have been angry. He should have felt his authority usurped. Instead, he felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation: relief. He was not alone in this fight anymore. He had an ally, a very trying, very intelligent, very effective ally. He pulled up a chair, the scrape of its legs, loud in the silent room, and sat down opposite her. Show me," he said. And for the next hour in the quiet heart of the cold house, Lord Blackwood sat and listened as Clara Ashton explained the numbers to him, her voice a calm, steady current in the sea of his chaos. The thaw had begun, not with a grand gesture, but with a shared candle and a column of crooked figures. The first snow of winter fell silently during the night, blanketing the overgrown gardens and stark branches of Blackmore in a deceptive layer of purity. Inside the house, however, a different kind of storm was gathering. It began with a cough from the youngest, Thomas, a small, dry sound that quickly deepened into a chest-rattling fever. By midday, the boy was burning up, his usual boisterous energy replaced by a limp, fretful misery. The nursery maid was frantic. Mrs. Gable wrung her hands and spoke of sending for the doctor in the village, a 10-mile ride through what was becoming a blizzard. Lord Blackwood was a statue of helpless terror. He stood in the nursery doorway, his face pale, watching his son toss and turn. This was how it had begun with Eleanor, a winter chill that had turned into a fatal fever. The past was reaching out for him, and he was paralyzed. It was Clara who took control. Mrs. Gable, send a stable hand for Dr. Finch, immediately, but tell him to ride with care. He is no use to us with a broken neck, she said, her voice sharp with purpose. Mary, she addressed the nursery maid, need basins of cool water and as many clean cloths as you can find, and send for more firewood. This room must be kept warm, but not stuffy. As she moved to the child's bedside, her movements calm and efficient, she spoke to Thomas in a low, soothing voice as she gently sponged his forehead. The boy, delirious, whimpered and pushed her away. Go away," he muttered. "I want Mama?" Clara's hand stilled for a second. From the doorway, Lord Blackwood flinched as if struck. This was the heart of their shared problem, the ghost of a wife and mother who could not be summoned. I know you do, sweetheart," Clara whispered, her voice full of a tenderness. No one in the house had yet heard from her. But your mama is not here. So for now you must make do with me." She did not try to distract him or lie to him. She met his grief with simple, unadorned truth. She resumed bathing his face and wrists, her touch gentle but firm. For hours, she did not leave his side. The storm raged outside, and it became clear that Dr. Finch would not arrive before morning, if at all. The household looked to its master, but Lord Blackwood remained a spectre, pacing the hall outside the nursery, trapped in the prison of his own memories. They looked to Clara instead. She sent for mustard and made a plaster for Tomas's chest, an old remedy her own mother had used. She brewed a tea of willow bark and coaxed the boy to drink a few sips. She sat and told him stories in a low murmur, not caring if he was listening, simply filling the frightening, fevered silence with the sound of her voice. Late into the night, Maxwell stood again in the doorway. The fire was burning low, and the only other light came from a single candle on the bedside table. It cast a halo around Clara's bent head. She had pulled a chair close to the small bed and was slumped in it, fast asleep, her head resting on her arms on the mattress. One of her hands was still loosely covering Tomas's own. The boy's breathing was easier, his tossing replaced by a deep, settled sleep. The crisis had passed. He looked at this woman who had brought her quiet, relentless logic to his crumbling world. He had seen her as an accountant, a manager, a necessary but abrasive force. He had argued with her over candles and authority and the proper running of his house. But here, in the dim, quiet sick room, she was something else entirely. She was care, she was constancy. She was the one who had stayed when he had frozen. He stepped into the room, retrieved a heavy wool blanket from the end of another bed, and gently draped it over her shoulders. She did not stir. He stood there for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her shoulders, the candlelight catching the warm tones in her brown hair. He felt a powerful, protective urge that had nothing to do with her role as his steward. It was for her, Clara. The next morning, Tomas's fever was gone, leaving him weak but lucid. When he woke, he found Clara sitting beside him, reading a book. He looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time in 2 days. "Oh, thank you," he whispered. It was a small breakthrough, but in the cold house of Blackmore, it was an earthquake. The incident shifted something fundamental in the household. The staff, who had witnessed her competence and tireless care, began to look at her with a new respect. The whispers died down, replaced by a grudging admiration. Even Mrs. Pratt Gable seemed to thaw, asking for Clara's opinion on a menu rather than simply awaiting her orders. Arthur, the angry older son, remained her most stalwart opponent. He saw her growing influence as a threat to his mother's memory. He found her in the library, where she was now a regular presence, working opposite his father at the large partner's desk. "You're selling the bay mare," he accused, his voice trembling with adolescent fury. She was Mama's favorite." Lord Blackwood looked up, ready to intervene. But Clara gave him a subtle shake of her head. This was an argument she had to win on her own. Arthur? I am," she said calmly, not looking up from her ledger. You have no right." She was Mama saw Clara finally raised her head, her gaze meeting his. "Your mother also loved her tenants, did she not? She established a fund to provide blankets and coal to the poorest families in the village every winter. That fund is empty. The money from the sale of the mare, which is a luxury we cannot currently afford, will pay to replenish that fund. It will keep 3 families from freezing this winter. Which action do you think your mother would prefer? To keep a horse in a warm stable, or to keep a child warm in its bed?" Arthur stared at her, his anger faltering in the face of her unassailable logic. She had not belittled his sentiment. She had honored his mother's memory far more effectively than he had, by invoking her character, her kindness. He was left with nothing to say. He mumbled something unintelligible and fled the room, defeated. Maxwell looked at Clara, a slow smile touching his lips for the first time she had ever seen it. "You are a formidable opponent, Miss Ashton." "I do not seek to be formidable, my lord. I do not seek to be formidable, my lord," she replied, though a faint blush rose on her cheeks. "I only seek to be correct." From that day on their evenings at the dining table changed. He began to ask her questions, not as a challenge but out of genuine curiosity. He asked for her opinion on crop rotation, on the renegotiation of the timber contract, on a dispute between 2 tenants. He started calling her Clara in private. She in turn found herself speaking more freely, sharing her observations, not just about the accounts, but about the house, the land, the people. The vast space between them at the dining table began to shrink. One evening he simply picked up his plate and glass and moved to the chair beside her. The silence that fell was no longer excruciating, but companionable. One night, as they worked late in the library, he looked up from a letter he was writing. "My late wife is, sister, Lady Beatrice, will be arriving tomorrow. She means to stay through Christmas." Clara's pen stopped moving. She had heard of Lady Beatrice from the staff. She was the self-appointed guardian of Eleanor's memory, a woman who saw Blackmore as a shrine to her late sister, and the children as its sacred relics. As she comes every year, Maxwell continued, his voice tight, as she inspects things, to ensure Eleanor's standards are being upheld. I see, Clara said, her voice neutral. She understood perfectly. Lady Beatrice was not coming to visit. She was coming to judge. And Clara, the upstart steward who had opened the curtains and sold the favorite mare, would be the primary subject of her inquisition. Another storm was coming, and this one would not be so easily weathered. Lady Beatrice Finch arrived like a ship in full sail, sweeping into the hall in a flurry of expensive furs and pronouncements. She was a handsome woman, a few years older than her late sister, with the same fair hair but with eyes that were hard and assessing, where Eleanor's, in the portrait, were warm and laughing. She embraced the children with a theatrical flourish, then turned her critical gaze on the hall. "Ah, well, Maxwell," she said, her voice carrying a clipped aristocratic authority. The house is certainly brighter." Eleanor always preferred a more subdued light. She found it restful. It was the first shot, a subtle insinuation that Clara's improvements were a betrayal of the late Viscountess's taste. Maxwell stiffened. The children need the light. Beatrice course. A she, said, her smile not reaching her eyes. She then turned her full attention to Clara, who was standing quietly by the staircase. "And you must be the A person Abernathy found. The accountant." The word was delivered with a faint, dismissive curl of her lip. She did not offer her hand. "I am Clara Ashton, the household steward," Clara replied, her tone even a steward. Beatrice repeated, tasting the word. "Ah, how very modern. My brother-in-law is full of surprises." She swept past Clara, leaving a trail of expensive French perfume and chilly disapproval. Beatrice's visit cast a pall over the fragile peace Clara had established. She moved through the house like a general inspecting a conquered territory, her eyes catching every change, every decision Clara had made. She questioned the new linens, the altered menus, the open curtains. Each question was a small act of war, designed to undermine Clara's authority and re-establish her own as the true keeper of Eleanor's flame. Her grievance was, in its own way, sympathetic. She had loved her sister deeply, and she saw Blackmore not as a living home, but as a memorial. To change anything was, in her eyes, to desecrate it. She genuinely believed she was protecting her sister's legacy and her sister's children from a grasping interloper. Clara understood this, but understanding did not make the attacks any less pointed. The children regressed under their aunt's influence. Arthur became sullen again, emboldened by Beatrice's quiet criticisms of Clara. Edith grew more silent, caught between her loyalty to her mother's sister and her budding trust in the woman who had nursed her brother. The main battleground became the upcoming Christmas celebration. Beatrice insisted on recreating every detail of the last Christmas they had shared with Eleanor. The same menu, the same decorations, the same guest list for a formal dinner on Christmas Eve. "It is what Eleanor would have wanted," she declared, daring anyone to disagree. "It is important for the children to have that continuity." She did not argue, she simply complied, procuring the requested supplies and overseeing the preparations with her usual efficiency. To fight Beatrice on this front would be to play into her hands, to appear as the enemy of tradition and memory. But Beatrice was not content with passive aggression. Seeing Clara's quiet competence and Maxwell's growing reliance on her, she decided a more direct assault was necessary. The Christmas Eve dinner was to be her theater of war. She invited a dozen of the local gentry, the very people who had whispered about Blackmore's decline for the past 2 years. Her plan was simple: to humiliate Clara publicly, to expose her as a common, grasping servant who had overstepped her station. On the evening of the dinner, Clara, dressed with care in her best gown, a simple dark silk she had made herself. It was elegant, but understated. She knew she was walking into an ambush. As she descended the grand staircase, she saw Beatrice in the hall below, a vision in crimson velvet, greeting her guests. When she saw Clara, a triumphant smile touched her lips. The trap was sprung during the main course. The conversation had been stilted, the guests unsure of the new dynamic in the house. Beatrice, seated at Maxwell's right hand, saw her moment. "It is such a comfort, Maxwell," she began, her voice carrying across the table. "A Tosi Blackmore so well managed again. One hears such stories. Of course, one must be so careful when giving such a extensive authority to hired helpa." She looked directly at Clara. "Tell me, Miss Ashton, your people are from trade, are they not? I find that so fascinating." Such a different world. The table fell silent. It was a brutal, deliberate blow, designed to remind everyone of Clara's inferior origins. Clara placed her fork down gently. My father was a merchant, Lady Beatrice, yes. He taught me that a well-run ledger is a thing of beauty, and that integrity is a currency more valuable than gold. I have found both lessons to be true." Her response was calm, dignified. It gave Beatrice no emotional reaction to seize upon. Frustrated, Beatrice pressed her attack. "Indeed. And you have certainly put your skills to use. I was looking at the household accounts today. I noticed a very large expenditure to a local seamstress. A personal indulgence, Miss Ashton?" The insinuation was clear. Clara was using the estate's money to buy herself fine clothes. This was the engineered humiliation, the accusation of theft dressed up as a polite inquiry. A wave of heat washed over Clara. This was the lie she had anticipated. She had, in fact, commissioned the seamstress, but not for herself. Guilty of what exactly, Lady Beatrice?" Clara asked, her voice quiet, but carrying in the stillness of being competent, of caring for this house and the people in it. "I have done nothing here that I would not account for, to God or to Lord Blackwood." Beatrice laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound. "Oh, it is all very noble, I am sure. But you are not family. You are an employee, and you seem to be forgetting your place." Before Clara could respond, a new voice cut in. It was Maxwell. He had been sitting in stony silence, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Now he rose slowly to his feet, his imposing height commanding the attention of the entire room. He did not look at Beatrice. He looked at his guests, his gaze sweeping over their curious, scandalized faces. Then his eyes found Clara's, and they were filled with a cold, protective fury. "Miss Ashton's place," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Is wherever she chooses it to be in this house. Her authority is my authority. Her integrity is my integrity. For 2 years this house has been drowning in grief. The fires were out, the curtains were drawn, and my children were lost in the shadows." He turned to Beatrice, and the force of his anger was like a physical blow. "You speak of Eleanor's memory. You have tried to preserve it by turning this house into a mausoleum. Miss Ashton has honored Eleanor's memory by bringing life back into her home, by caring for her children, by reminding me that a house is not just a monument to the past, but a home for the living." He paused, his gaze returning to Clara. "Fealty seems already abundant this evening. I see no reason to add mine by allowing my steward, my friend, to be insulted at my own table." It was a stunning public declaration, a line drawn in the sand, but the reckoning was not over. Another voice spoke, hesitant but clear. It was Arthur. He had been watching the exchange, his face a turbulent mask of confusion and dawning understanding. He stood up, knocking his chair slightly. Right about the seamstress," he said, looking at Beatrice. The money was for new winter coats for me and Edith and Thomas. Ours were too small." He looked down at his own sleeves, which were now the proper length, "and for new blankets for the tenant farmers. She told me so herself," she said, As she said ask what Mama would have done. The room was utterly still. And then, the final most devastating blow to Beatrice's attack landed. Edith, the silent child, pushed back her chair, walked around the long table to where Clara sat, and without a word, took her hand. She stood beside her. A small, defiant figure, holding on as if to an anchor in a storm. Beatrice stared at the scene, her face pale. Her army had deserted to the enemy. She had been defeated not by anger or by argument, but by this simple, unassailable truth, spoken aloud by the very children she claimed to be protecting. The public humiliation had been hers. The gentry at the table looked away, embarrassed for her. She was no longer a righteous defender of a legacy. She was just a cruel woman who had been proven wrong. She had been made irrelevant. Clara looked at Maxwell, standing like a guard at the head of the table. She looked at Arthur, whose face held a grudging respect. She looked down at Edith's small, warm hand clutching hers. For the first time in her life, she felt what it was to be chosen, to be defended, to belong. A tear she had not realized she was holding back slipped down her cheek, and she did nothing to wipe it away. Later that night, after the last of the stunned guests had departed and Lady Beatrice had retired to her room in a cloud of furious silence, the house fell quiet. The battle was over. Clara, emotionally exhausted, retreated to the one place she felt truly safe, the library. The fire was burning brightly, casting a warm dancing light over the thousands of sleeping books. She sank into one of the large leather armchairs, the silence of the room a soothing balm on her frayed nerves. She had won. They had won. But the victory felt fragile, the emotions of the evening too large and tumultuous to comprehend. She did not hear him enter, but she felt a shift in the air. She looked up to see Maxwell standing by the door watching her. He had shed his formal dinner jacket and looked younger, less burdened than she had ever seen him. The cold Viscount was gone, replaced by the man who had defended her. He walked slowly into the room and came to a stop before her chair. He did not speak for a long time, simply looked at her, his gray eyes full of an emotion she could not decipher. "I have been a fool," he said, at last, his voice rough. "Ah, coward and a fool." Clara shook her head. "Ah, you were magnificent, my lord." "Ah, no," he insisted, taking a step closer. "Ah, was magnificent for 10 minutes this evening. I have been a fool for 2 years. I built walls of grief and duty around myself and called it strength. I let this house grow cold. I let my children drift away from me. I was so afraid of dishonoring Eleanor's memory that I nearly destroyed her legacy." He looked around the warm, firelit room. Then you came here, Clara? You walked into my fortress of misery, and you started arguing. You argued with the darkness by opening the curtains. You argued with the cold by lighting the fires. You argued with my neglect by caring for my children. You argued with my despair by simply doing your work, day after day, with that infuriating, wonderful logic of yours. He knelt before her chair, bringing their faces level. It was a gesture of such profound humility from this proud, powerful man that it took her breath away. "You never once tried to win an argument," he murmured, his gaze searching hers. "You only ever sought to find the truth. And the truth is, you saved us. You saved my children. You saved this house. And you saved me from myself, Furs." His honesty was a raw, vulnerable thing. Clara felt her own carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. "I hired a steward," he said, a wry, sad smile touching his lips. But I found the heart of my home." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "But I find that I cannot bear the thought of you ever leaving, Clara. I am asking you to stay, not as my steward, but as my wife." The words hung in the air, both a plea and a promise. This was everything she could have ever dreamed of. And yet, a lifetime of being merely useful, of being a transaction, rose up in her. "My lorda, Maxwell," she said, her voice trembling. "Is this gratitude? Because I balanced your books and nursed your son, I will not be a reward. I will not be a debt you feel you must repay. Do not say it, if it is only gratitude." He looked at her, and his expression was so full of unguarded tenderness that it made her heart ache. "A gratitude," he shook his head slowly. "A gratitude is what I feel for Dr. Finch, for setting a broken bone. It is a polite, manageable emotion. What I feel for you, Clara, is terrifying. It is the hope that this house might know laughter again. It is the realization that the thought of my day ending without our quiet conversation in this library is unbearable. It is the desire to see your face across the breakfast table for the rest of my life." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I did not expect to care whether you stayed. It is what I thought. I asked for a temporary solution, but you became essential. I stopped arguing with you because I realized I did not want to win. I wanted to agree. I wanted to be on your side. I love you, Clara Ashton. Not because you are useful, but because you are you. Please, be my wife." Tears were streaming freely down her face now, but they were tears of joy, of a profound, soul-deep relief. The overlooked woman, the household tool, the poor relation, all of those false selves fell away, burned to ash in the warmth of his gaze. Yes," she whispered. Yes, Maxwell. I will." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 2 years. He leaned in, and his kiss was not the practiced move of a sophisticated nobleman. It was clumsy and earnest and breathtakingly real. It was the end of 100 arguments and the beginning of a lifetime of listening. It was the sealing of a bargain that had nothing to do with ledgers and everything to do with a shared mended heart. 6 months later, spring came to Blackmore, in a riot of color and life. The neglected gardens were now a tapestry of tulips and daffodils, tended by a head gardener, who took his orders from the new Viscountess with cheerful respect. The sound of children's laughter echoed in the corridors that had once been silent. The great house breathed again. Clara stood on the terrace, a basket of cuttings on her arm, watching her children play on the newly green lawn. Arthur was teaching Thomas how to properly throw a ball, his earlier sullenness replaced by the easy confidence of a boy who felt secure in his world. Edith was nearby, carefully arranging a bouquet of wildflowers, her face serene. She no longer clutched the worn ribbon. It was kept safely in a small silver box in her room. A treasured memory, not a desperate anchor. Lady Beatrice had left the morning after the disastrous dinner and had not returned. A cool but civil correspondence was maintained, but her power over the house and its inhabitants was broken forever. The estate, under Clara's continued, and now official guidance, was thriving. The tenants were paid, the roofs were mended, and the village was beginning to recover. The ledgers were a thing of beauty, their columns straight, their balances true, and Maxwell came out onto the terrace, his step lighter than it had been a year ago. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He no longer wore black, but the deep blue of his coat matched the spring sky. "A looking at your kingdom, my lady," he murmured into her ear. She smiled, leaning back against him. "Our kingdom. And it is finally solvent." "Ah," he chuckled, a warm, easy sound. My brilliant, practical wife. You woo me with talk of solvency? Ah, it is a far more reliable basis for a happy marriage than flowery poetry," she teased. He turned her in his arms, his expression growing serious. He looked over at the children, then back at her. "I found a letter this morning," he said. From Abernathy. "The one he wrote to me, proposing your employment." He wrote. She will win every argument you start. My advice is to stop arguing and start listening." Maxwell shook his head in wonder. He was right. It was the best advice I ever took. That evening, as Clara tucked a sleepy Thomas into bed, he threw his arms around her neck. "A good night, Mama," he whispered. the word as natural and easy as breathing. Clara's heart swelled. She kissed his forehead, her hand lingering on his soft hair. She went to Edith's room next, who showed her the drawing she had made of the garden. At the bottom, she had written, "A our gardena," in careful, looping letters. Finally, she stopped at Arthur's door. He was reading, but he looked up as she entered. "A good night, Arthur? A good night?" he said. And then, just as she was about to leave, he added, "A Clara." It was not the formal "A Miss Ashdana" or the hostile silence of before. It was simple acceptance. It was peace. She returned to the library, where Maxwell was waiting. The portrait of his late wife, Eleanor, still hung on the wall, her beautiful, laughing face looking down on them. Clara had insisted it remain. Eleanor was not a rival to be vanquished or a ghost to be exorcised. She was a part of the story of this house, the mother of these children, the woman Maxwell had first loved. There was room for her memory here, now that the grief was no longer suffocating. Maxwell held out his hand, and she took it, lacing her fingers through his. He led her to the window, and they stood together, looking out at the moonlit grounds of their home. She had come to a house of silence and shadows, a place of unspoken arguments and immovable grief. She had answered the arguments with truth, and she had filled the silence with life. She had not replaced the woman who came before her. She had simply become the woman who stayed. And in the quiet peace of the house, surrounded by the family she had healed and the man she loved, Clara knew she was finally truly home. Do you have a favorite moment when someone finally started listening in your own life? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below, and to know where in the world you're watching from. Your stories connect us all. If you enjoyed Clara and Maxwell's journey, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, courage, and unexpected, happily ever afters. We have a new story waiting for you tomorrow.